all you need to do is compare the crowd reactions to literally hear Microsoft's Xbox business going from one of the lowest moments in its history to a triumphant return over the course of 2 years. Here's Xbox leader Phil Spencer announcing the pricing for the Xbox One console back in 2013.
$499 in the US and 499 euros in European markets.
Yes, that was a murmur of shock at the price, which was $100 more than anyone expected. It was followed by a smattering of obligatory cheers. But here is Spencer again, 2 years later in 2015, making a follow-up announcement about the Xbox One.
Last year, the team decided to tackle a feature that has been consistently at the top of your request list. And while we weren't sure it was possible, today I'm pleased to announce Xbox One backward compatibility.
Now, that is the kind of unbridled crowd reaction that every tech executive dreams about. What happened in between over the course of those 2 years is one of several case studies in a new book called The Insider's Guide to Innovation at Microsoft. As the book explains, the Xbox One launch was a classic example of misalignment in a framework known as BXT, or Business, Experience, and Technology.
We got too focused on some of the T, the technology that excited us, but maybe wasn't meeting the need of the users. And we got a little too excited about the B. We put it at a price point that was, let's say, towards the high end. And the gaming community let us know about this clearly and very vocally.
This is one of the book's authors, Dean Carignan, who was working in the Xbox business at the time.
To the organization's credit, they pivoted back and they really changed the product itself. But it was just interesting to watch at the time how an organization that had kept those things in balance could slowly drift and lose that balance. And so I think that framework is something everyone can use in any scenario. And anytime you look at your business, BXT, are they in balance? Is one over-indexing? How do we course correct?
In that way, the book identifies many broadly applicable business lessons by looking at patterns in Microsoft's successes and also in its failures, using different Microsoft businesses in various stages and scenarios. The book was written by two Microsoft business strategists and innovation leaders, Dean Carignan, who now focuses on AI in the company's Office of the Chief Scientist, and Joanne Garbin, who created and led Microsoft's Regenerative Data Center of the Future program as part of the company's sustainability initiatives. Other case studies in the book include Microsoft's Visual Studio Code, Office, Bing, Cognitive Services, Microsoft Research, and the company's approach to responsible innovation. On this special episode of the Geekwire Podcast, as part of our Microsoft at 50 series, we'll get more insights from the new book, The Insider's Guide to Innovation at Microsoft. That's coming up after this. Microsoft at 50 is an independent Geekwire editorial project made possible with support from Accenture.
Hello, John Gingrich here, Senior Managing Director and Global Lead of our Microsoft account at Accenture. Accenture proudly recognizes Microsoft's 50th anniversary, and we're honored to mark our 35-year relationship as a trusted partner and change driver, delivering comprehensive services spanning 120 countries in support of Microsoft's enterprise. Together, we're positioned to deliver transformation for the next 50 years. We're ready. Let there be change.
For more installments in the Microsoft at 50 series and links to more information about Accenture's work with Microsoft, see geekwire.com/Microsoft50. That's geekwire.com/Microsoft50. Welcome to Geekwire from geekwire.com in Seattle. I'm Todd Bishop. I'm joined this week by Dean Carignan. He is the co-author with Joanne Garbin of the new book, The Insider's Guide to Innovation at Microsoft. A 20-year veteran of the company, he's worked on strategic initiatives including the Xbox and AI at Microsoft Research, and he currently leads frontier projects in the Office of the Chief Scientific Officer. Dean, thanks very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
I have been immersed in the Microsoft culture, well, for decades, but even more so over the past few months as part of our reporting on Microsoft's 50th anniversary. So I really enjoyed your book. It felt like being able to go in and like read the secret recipe at KFC, except way more cool and way more fun. So I'm looking forward to talking to you about this. And one of the things that struck me in reading the book were the lessons that came out of failure. And I think it surprised me, and maybe I just gravitate toward that as a reporter as well. But I mean, this is a book written by two people who've worked inside Microsoft, who continue to work inside Microsoft. And the things that came out of struggle or failure, like the Xbox after the debacle of the Xbox One launch, Windows Mobile and Windows Phone giving birth to cognitive services as a prelude to the current age of AI, and Bing's very pragmatic approach to competing with the dominant force of Google. So I'm wondering, just to start, did you and Joanne gravitate toward these moments of struggle or failure as crucibles of innovation, or did you just happen to find those as you went along?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm so glad you started there. By design, when we were setting out to write the book, we were very intentional that we would write about successes as well as failures. One of the limitations in writing on innovation these days is that we often only see the successes, and we see the stories compressed down into this very rarefied form where it looks like it was easy, fast, and without struggle. So even as we were planning the chapters and the case studies, we decided we would tell both sides of the story. Interestingly, the very first person we interviewed for the very first chapter, Xbox, the first thing they spoke about was a failure. And they spoke about the mislaunch of the Xbox One and missing customer expectations, but how they reacted to that and introspected and fundamentally changed the way they thought about product design and management and go-to-market, and how it made the organization stronger and more innovative today. So it was both a going-in hypothesis that we should, and it was also borne out in our research because people always pointed to the failures as well as the successes.
So let's take a step back. Tell me about the origins of this book. You've worked at the company for 20 years. I know Joanne Garbin, your co-author, is also someone who's worked at the company. Why did you decide to write this book? And tell me about how it came about.
Yeah, so I work in AI research. Joanne works in sustainability. And collectively, we kind of looked at how the world was changing and how fast it's changing now and how much faster it's going to change. And we realized that everyone, every company, every organization, and every individual is going to have to reinvent themselves to some extent in this new world. And we wanted there to be a how-to guide. And we looked around us and we said, well, where is their experience and learnings to draw upon? And of course, Microsoft presented itself, a company that's been around 50 years, has reinvented itself at least 4 times as a corporate player, has had setbacks and successes, but in its 50th year is still driving innovation and changing and reflecting the world around it. So we decided we would write a book based on learnings at Microsoft. Initially, we thought it would be mostly a book for people at Microsoft, but to our amazement, the patterns we were discovering were universal. Joanne had seen them outside Microsoft. I had seen them before I joined Microsoft. We had seen them within. And we realized this is a book for everyone. This is a book for anyone who wants to be more innovative, either in their professional life or personal life or both. And so we wrote it as a book for general readership. So it evolved as we went on, as we started to do the research and realized, that the patterns really were universal. We will take all the proceeds from the book and donate them to STEAM charities. And the A there is important in STEAM because we believe in the arts as well as the rest of STEM. And the idea there is to kind of cultivate the next generation of innovators to bring them into this pipeline.
I also found myself kind of stepping out of the Microsoft Beat bubble as I was reading and thinking, like, what's somebody who's walking through a Barnes & Noble in, Silicon Valley and sees this book going to think about the notion of finding inspiration and takeaways about innovation from Microsoft, because just thinking back, I can remember, I think it might have been a Macworld or some sort of Apple launch event that I went to where one of the signs was, Redmond, start your photocopiers. There's like this stereotype about, for as successful as Microsoft has become, it's a multi-trillion-dollar company that, as you say, has been around for 50 years and has reinvented itself at least 4 times. There's a stereotype about Microsoft being a fast follower, which you talk about in the book. Like, what would you say to somebody who said, Microsoft, they just do what everybody else does, a year later, and there's nothing to be learned there?
That is a great point. And when we write the Bing chapter, we actually talk about this specifically because there certainly was a period where almost explicitly Microsoft had embraced the fast follower strategy. We talk about how sort of in the browser wars of the kind of mid to late 90s, we were late, but we followed and we became dominant. And that did breed probably a certain amount of complacency, maybe even arrogance. But what cured us of that was losing search. And search was this real wake-up call where if a new business model and a new way of operating a company comes forward and gets enough momentum, you'll never catch up. I tell the story in the book about how I was an analyst in our online services division. And it was only when Google went public that we could see how profitable search was and how much money they were making relative to our online services. And the company did pivot and it did move quickly, but it was too late. You had, what strategists like to call competitive moats. You had positive feedback loops helping Google. And so I think that really cured the company of arrogance and complacency. And we would say things like, let's not get Googled. Let's not let that happen again. And I think it's a characteristic of Microsoft to learn from those mistakes and to actually internalize and respond and to not make the same mistake again. There will always be another mistake, and no company, fails to have those setbacks, but it's the learning and adaptation that I think is most important that I've seen played out around me.
I think the Bing case study was one of my favorites from the book, and it had a specific lesson about how to manage teams in those situations where you are the underdog. And it was a real cultural lesson. And there was a mentality shift that you write about in that business. You look at that Google 90% market share, and to say to people on the team, hey, you're going to need to beat Google, is probably not realistic. So what did they do instead?
This is what I love about the Bing case study. There was a point in time where I think everyone understood and accepted that we were not going to become number one in search, which is Microsoft is hard to accept to not be dominant. At the same time, it was agreed that search is a strategically important area, both technologically and also for society. You don't want a monopoly in a situation of information distribution.
Operating systems, it's fine.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Sorry.
Save that for another interview. But
Keep going.
So the decision was made that we will remain in search, we will compete with Google, but we will do it with a dramatically smaller budget. We will make this a financially responsible investment for the company. And what's amazing about that, and it's a big theme in the book, is that constraints breed creativity. When you're given very hard constraints and you have to hit certain goals within them, like financial constraints, you are forced to think very divergently out of the box and come up with creative ways of solving the problems that a larger and a better resourced player might not actually pursue. The example I love in Bing was they moved to a form of AI called deep learning almost before anyone else in the search industry did, partially because classical machine learning at the time required huge teams, massive expenses, large fleets of scientists. And this deep learning approach, which is the standard now, was nascent. You could hire people in, you could become relatively expert in it in a short amount of time, and the constraints they were under forced them to innovate and in the end take a lead which has helped us. We also write about this. Bing became the tip of the spear for a lot of the OpenAI models as they came in.
And from a team perspective, from a management perspective, they basically focused, as I remember it from your recounting in the book, on growing share and really made specific achievable milestones that they could actually make happen.
Yeah. This is another general theme, is that there's often a perception that innovation isn't measurable, or it's hard to manage, or it just sort of happens. But the teams we studied that did it very well always had metrics that would measure the benefits of their innovation. In the case of Bing, it would be fractions of a point of market share. It was just that hard to move the needle. Now, in a space like search, a fraction of a point of market share is tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's financially meaningful. But they developed measurement systems for getting to very fine-grained share views that would allow them to run experiments, tweak the algorithm, make changes, and see these little movements in their share and celebrate it and then repeat. And so it was a great example of innovating the whole business model and the whole way you operate in order to compete in this really difficult head-to-head situation.
And the thread from Bing to Office was also interesting. I want to get into the thread from Bing to AI in a moment, but the thread from Bing to Office was interesting because here you have Google as a dominant player in search. And to your point, I think Microsoft was perhaps complacent in some ways until maybe the Google IPO, as you say. But when Google started to get into docs and sheets and slides, I mean, that is Microsoft's bread and butter.
Yes, absolutely. And a broader theme here, and I'll go back to Bing, a broader theme is if you want to innovate in a large corporation and you look only at the financial payoff of the innovation, that is probably a long point in the future. So to gain support and to galvanize people to work with you, you need a broader vision. You need to sell more of the benefits to the company. In Bing's case, they were becoming expert in indexing documents, in searching large corpora of text, in doing fast lookup. All those things were fully relevant to Office and SQL Server and other parts of the company. So they set themselves up as not only a competitor to Google, but a center of excellence within Microsoft, and by design had teams to spread and diffuse those innovations. And so by doing that, they're sort of bringing this dual benefit to the company, which makes it more of a reasonable investment for the whole company.
It's almost like they were not exactly Microsoft Research, but the theme is the same. You know, they're doing things that can apply to others.
And they partnered very closely with Microsoft Research. It was interesting how many breakthroughs came out of MSR into Bing for maturation and then out to the rest of the company.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, on the point that you just made about metrics, there was another connection there to Office because they moved away in Office, in the case study that you present in the book, from like tracking technical requirements and ship dates into something they called the kept rate.
Yes.
Can you explain that?
Yeah. So if you look at the history of Office, and it blows my mind to think of this, but it was originally a physical product, right? It was boxed software that would go out on CD-ROMs, and it would go out to companies that would install it and deploy it. The customer was the procurement manager or the IT manager, and they would often react favorably to a long list of features, bulletized. Maybe they don't understand what all of them are, but it looks great on the back of that package that you're buying. Over time, we started to deliver Office digitally, and the most important thing became the end user. Are they getting value out of it? A realization was made at a certain point that the whole sort of operating model at Office was about adding more features, which again, in the prior world makes sense. In a new world where you're online and subscription and user-focused, it doesn't. So the divisions actually sent out Sumit Chauhan, who we interviewed, made this declaration, no new features. We're putting a moratorium on new features, and we're going to make sure people are getting value out of the features they have. And that led to the idea of kept rate. If you push a new feature, we have a new feature in the ribbon or something, are people discovering it? Are they using it, and are they coming back to it? And those are the features we'll invest in. And if it's not delivering value, we'll retire or decrement it. And it's such a good example of the courage that's needed to take a process that has been working for years or decades and do something like what Sumit did and radically change it and stand by that until the benefits start to accrue.
Well, I really enjoyed the Office case study, the Bing case study. I learned a lot from the Xbox case study, and I enjoyed that one in part because I was there, like for the Xbox One launch. And that was the moment where the Xbox team really over-indexed on one part of this 3-part framework, like a triad that you present, BXT. So for people who don't know what BXT is, I think Jay Allard might have coined this term. What is it?
Jay Allard brought it forward very early on, and it was when they had realized that they had a lot of really smart engineers in early Xbox, and they were building interesting and powerful technology, but they weren't profitable and they weren't necessarily meeting the user expectations. So Jay brought forward this idea that any innovation, any new plan will have to describe 3 things: B, the business rationale; X, the experience, what the user is going to get from this innovation; and T, the technology. And when you apply that model successfully, the technology becomes an enabler of the other 2. You want to be providing a compelling experience in a way that is, profitable and sustainable from a business perspective, and the technology enables that. If you're an engineering culture like Microsoft, you tend to go T first, and as kind of an afterthought, you'll think of the other 2 things.
Well, I liked this in part because it's one of these examples from the book that is universally applicable. I mean, almost every business, let alone tech company, can take these 3 things and think, how in balance are we on these 3 things? Are we leading with the right thing for our business and our scenario? And there was a moment, ironically, where Xbox got out of balance on this.
That's exactly right. And it's funny how clearly you can see it in retrospect. There was the first Xbox, modestly successful, Xbox 360, hugely successful. And as we moved to Xbox One launch, and I was part of Xbox at the time, we got too focused on some of the T, the technology that excited us, but maybe wasn't meeting the need of the users. And we got a little too excited about the B. We put it at a price point that was, let's say, towards the high end. And the gaming community let us know about this clearly and very vocally. And to the organization's credit, they pivoted back and they really changed the product itself. But it was just interesting to watch at the time how an organization that had kept those things in balance could slowly drift and lose that balance. And so I think that framework is something everyone can use in any scenario. And anytime you look at your business, BXT. Are they in balance? Is one over-indexing? How do we course correct?
And in the case of the Xbox One, the B that was over-indexed was the notion of, well, it was both a B and a T, business and technology, was this always on, because it was great in terms of piracy, making sure that, every time you put in a disc or started to play a game, you actually had the rights to do it because it was checking with the server to make sure that was the case. And also it was a great technology solution because, streaming games and all that. But from an experience standpoint, now, this is an example where I think perhaps the backlash prior to release might not have been justified given the way it turned out. But at any rate, the gamers from the experience standpoint did not want it to be always on.
Exactly. And what was, I think, interesting, so when we interviewed Phil Spencer and we were deconstructing the launch and everything, and we looked at Xbox today, we're like, a lot of those features actually have come back into the Xbox. Not always on, but a lot of what was presented in Xbox One is now part of the product. So Xbox One was in some ways ahead of its time. It was too early to be pushing those new technologies on the gaming community, and it was communicated poorly. And that's another aspect of innovation, is picking your timing, knowing the readiness of the market to accept certain things, and then being very good at messaging why you're bringing in, changing some things and not others. So it was a good product. I believe it was poorly timed and poorly communicated.
And it feels like the Xbox team, the Xbox division, has recovered from this with this insight in mind.
Exactly. And they really did. I mean, I was part of them up to the launch and after the launch, and you really saw this soul searching and this sense of we've let our community down and we've got to change that. And so I do think Xbox came back stronger as a result, but everyone just wishes we didn't have to go through that experience to embrace the change.
All right, Dean. So there was actually another case study that was my favorite for reasons that I can tell you about a little later on. And I want to talk about that when we come back. You're listening to Geekwire, and we will be right back. Welcome back. My guest this week is Dean Carignan. He is co-author with Joanne Garbin of the new book, The Insider's Guide to Innovation at Microsoft. Dean, I'll tell you about my favorite example in just a minute. But first, I want to ask you if you could go back in time and witness one Microsoft innovation milestone in person, something that you weren't there for, would there be one moment that you would choose to be able to be a fly on the wall in the conference room or the engineering floor?
There's one that I would love to have observed. So Visual Studio Code was born out of this understanding that Microsoft was very dominant with enterprise developers. But there was this fundamentally new class of web and mobile developers that were not using our products. And Scott Guthrie and Jason Zander grabbed Eric Gama and a few other folks and said, go out and get 10,000 happy born-in-the-web developers with a product. And once you've achieved that, we'll figure out how we shape and cultivate that market.
So to be clear, they didn't say, go build this.
Correct.
They said, build something that will attract to Microsoft these new developers, this new class of developers who would not have been coding in .NET in the past, just as an example.
Exactly.
What a cool challenge.
Exactly. And also mission clarity, acknowledging that we don't understand that market segment. So the most important thing is to engage and understand, and that will subsequently build the business around that. And of course, Visual Studio Code is now the most successful developer environment in the world. But I would have loved to be there when the team was commissioned.
Yeah.
And in the subsequent meeting where they said, how the hell are we going to go do that? Those are the two moments I wish I could have seen.
So I teased ahead to what my favorite case study was from the book. And I enjoyed all of them, and I learned something from all of them. But cognitive services, I think, was remarkable in a variety of different ways. And I gravitated toward it in part because I wrote stories about cognitive services at the time, and I didn't understand what was actually going on until I read your book. So this was a team that was born somewhat surprisingly out of the failure of Windows Mobile and Windows Phone, if I'm understanding it correctly. Mm-hmm. Can you take us from that moment and carry the thread forward to what cognitive services is and how it happened?
Yeah, and like every great story, there's twists and turns, but there was a point at Microsoft where we realized we were not going to have a phone, that the dominant platforms would be iPhone and Android. But of course, we acknowledged that mobile users were important. And so a small team under Harry Shum, who ran kind of research and AI at the time, decided that if we couldn't win the mobile user, maybe we could win the mobile developer. And so they started to look at the needs of that group beyond, of course, development platforms, which we were working on. And they concluded that those mobile developers needed AI models. Because how is the phone different from the PC? It's gathering different data. It's more frequently used for pictures and sound capture. It's got a GPS. All of this rich data could benefit from AI services. And in fact, those AI services were being built in Microsoft Research. So what they decided to do, and the vision, was let's take those models, let's put them in Azure, let's make them usable by developers who are developing for the mobile platform. And unsurprisingly, other platforms followed. What I love about that case study is that they didn't build a huge organization. They started with about 6 very junior PMs, and they went out and they connected the teams that already had the bits and bytes to pull it together. And they were very, very purposeful about making sure their partner teams got all of the credit.
That's what I liked about it. It was so non-stereotypical. It was this case of this team doing well by doing right by others. And to me, I don't know, it kind of made me feel, it was the feel-good case study of the book.
And that's why we love that case study. It was part of what motivated us to write it. And it's also this pattern that they did a couple things very smart. They were very small, they were very junior, and they had very senior sponsorship. At that time, Harry Shum reported, I believe, directly to Satya. And so they were able to go out and move fast and be connectors and not be a threat to anyone because, hey, these guys are just coming in to help us. And as I said before, what they built is the foundation of all of our AI model serving infrastructure today. So you think about outsized impact from a tiny team at the start.
Right. And you mentioned Harry Shum. And one of the keys there, and so there was a lesson not only for the team in terms of applicability to others as you're reading the book, but there was also a lesson for leaders because the reason they felt comfortable giving credit internally and perhaps even externally to the other teams they were working with inside the company was because they knew that Harry had their back. They knew that when it came time for reviews and promotions, even though they'd been, deflecting all the credit to others, he knew that they were doing the work.
And that is such a critical message for any innovator, because as an innovator, you've got to manage down, out, and up. And it's like, as I said before, the financial rewards are probably years out. So you've got to communicate non-financial benefits, prestige, customer joy, all of these things. And you've got to, we talk about it a lot in our third pattern, I believe, but communicate with emotion. Because you've got to get people excited and seeing the vision and understanding it. And that's what Harry was great about. Like, they had his ear and he was their sort of advocate and champion. And when you've got those things aligned, you can do incredible things with a small team.
As you're thinking about key takeaways from the book, is there one lesson that sort of hit you that you ended up changing your mindset about in terms of your own day-to-day work at the company?
Something that really resonated with me is that innovation requires risk-taking. And for many people, that's not a natural behavior. There's often an aversion to risk. And so to encourage that, you have to do some things in terms of changing the operating environment for your teams. One of the practices from Microsoft Research that I love is they changed the reward system to look not only at the outcome of a given effort, but also at the quality of the decision to actually launch into that effort. And the idea was that if someone made a good decision, took some risk, executed well, that should not be considered failure and penalized in the way that maybe some flawed execution or bad decision would be. And what I love about that is it's not just saying we want to encourage risk-taking, but it's changing one of the systems that influences behavior and really creating the environment that encourages the risk.
That's a good one. And another one along those same lines was the shift in a variety of teams to this notion of much more frequent releases or flights. Yeah. In fact, it's interesting. At one point, you make a distinction between the word release, which can have a sort of finality to it, and the word flight, which is more of a recurring event. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. And we saw this in many groups. The idea of a release or a launch creates this stress and anxiety that I got it right or I got it wrong. The idea of a flight is where we're going to release some new code, we're going to put it out there to some number of users, and then we're going to look and we're going to analyze it and we're going to change what's needed going forward. It reduces the anxiety level, encourages risk-taking, and what's beautiful about a flight is that a flight review has 2 areas of review. Was it successful from a business objective, and was it successful from a learning objective? And being very explicit about we do these things hopefully to succeed, but also to learn. And if you get good learnings, it wasn't a failure. And by having that kind of built into the idea of a flight, you create that sense that we can take chances and we can take risk, and it's not going to tank my career or, have those negative implications that a lot of people worry about.
So one of the case studies in the book is focused on responsibility. And I know from your bio that you're involved in what they call the Aether Committee. Aether Committee. Can you sort of explain what that is and how this look at responsible AI and responsible and ethical technology factored into the work that you did on the book with Joanne?
Yes. So one of the implications of innovation, and especially disruptive innovation, is it changes the world. And it can change the world for better, but there can be harmful outcomes, unexpected consequences, and so on. So we wrote a chapter called Innovating Responsibly. And the idea is that there are practices, many, kind of established at Microsoft, for moving fast, but not breaking the important things. And a couple of techniques we use there is, one is you taking safety and responsibility and doing what we call featureization. Don't treat those things like compliance. Treat them like features of the product that your users value and want and expect. And when you featureize these responsible elements, you'll shift left. You'll naturally bring them into the early planning process, and you'll be able to address them more holistically and substantively. The opposite of this would be, of course, to plan and prepare to launch, and at the end, as an afterthought, you think about factors like safety and responsibility. So I'm really proud of Microsoft's investments in this area. Aether, which I'm part of, has been active in responsible AI. And I think we've got a lot of really good practices, but always more to do.
This reminded me in part of the new focus, not new focus, but renewed and increased focus is probably the best phrase to use, on security. And I was thinking about it in the same way that I was joking earlier about the Redmond Start Your Photocopiers thing. Like, from an outside perspective, I could see where that would be one of the critical eyes that someone might cast on a book like this. And I wanted to ask you, you touch on security and you talk about the security development lifecycle, but if there's one thing that the book might get criticized for, I could see that it might be that you didn't go further in exploring the lessons from the explicit breaches that have made headlines in recent years and drawn scrutiny in Washington, D.C., and caused Microsoft to even change the way executives are compensated. What would you say to somebody saying, you should have done a case study on security in particular?
So something we do write about in the book is Bill Gates' famous security memo of the year 2000.
Trustworthy computing.
Trustworthy computing, where there were failures and breaches, and he pivoted the company to focus in on security above all else. And that memo is interesting and exciting and powerful to read. What's interesting is trustworthy computing defined a go-to-market or a development process called the secure development lifecycle, which inspired a lot of our work on responsible AI. So these threads are kind of through there that we learn in one domain and we apply to others. It is an ongoing process, and it is always, learning kind of the next set of techniques and building and improving. But I do think there's a lot of good foundations that we have to build on.
Well, it's interesting in reading the book. I obviously had multiple interests in it. I was fascinated with it as a glimpse inside Microsoft, this company that I've covered for many years. But I also found myself thinking about my own business life, my own, involvement in the business world, and starting to think about how to apply some of the lessons there. But as a tool inside Microsoft, I can imagine that if it's not happening already, that every new employee should get a copy of Satya Nadella's Hit Refresh and of The Insider's Guide to Innovation at Microsoft by Joanne and yourself.
We took a lot of motivation from Satya's book, and I think it did this kind of at the company level, this very general description of hitting refresh. And what I love about his subtitle is Recovering the Soul of Microsoft. It wasn't necessarily net new change or a new culture, but it was bringing back a lot of those startup kind of characteristics. And so what we did in our case studies was we went out and we found the groups that best embodied that. And so we're like the double click, I think, on Satya's book. We go down into the team or the group or the organizational level and really look specifically at innovation. And we wanted to do it in the form of storytelling. We originally thought, let's write this book but not talk about individuals. We want it to seem very general and applicable to anyone who reads it. But we did find that the people were so important. We had to name them. We had to kind of describe what they did. And hopefully as you read it, that brings it to life and you envision what you might be like in that role or making that decision or working through it. So we tried to make it very approachable and something that people could really get their arms around as they read it. I think that once a company has reinvented itself once, it becomes easier to do it again because you have the model for doing it and you have the experience. It's kind of like corporate neuroplasticity, the way our own brain can actually repeat things and do them over and over. I remember when we were going up against Google, and it was, some of the darkest days of taking on that challenge, and a very seasoned corporate vice president came in and he said, I know this seems impossible, but let me tell you about all these other times that we've been up against these challenges. And it was motivating and it was credible and it made it relatable because there was evidence that it had been done. And so you get almost like corporate lore after a while or corporate histories that you can tap into.
What would you say if you could summarize what has made Microsoft innovative over the years? Is there a way to express that in a nutshell?
I think it's a couple of things. One is I think the company has remained aware of its own disruptability. Not always, not consistently, but certainly Bill Gates imbued that into the company. I mean, we were born by disrupting a company that was thought to be indestructible, IBM. And that has kind of woven into our DNA and allowed us to constantly be aware that there's other companies that can come and do things better. The second thing I think is really learning from failure and not pointing fingers and not trying to assign blame, but absorbing and doing better. We saw it when we missed search. We saw it in the Xbox One launch. We saw it, kind of in mobile and finding creative ways in there. So the ability to respond, learn, and adapt. And the other thing that I think is really unique about Microsoft is we've got people crossing borders. One of the things I loved when I interviewed at Microsoft and the reason I came here instead of another tech company, I could tell they were really trying to get to know me and me as a person and how I would interact inside the group, with our partners, with other teams. And so the ability for a whole company to come together and push an initiative through the company and out into the marketplace is, I think, very powerful and very unique.
That's really interesting. And it meshes with something that Bill Gates said when I got to talk to him recently about his book and about the company's 50th anniversary, which is he was always very reluctant at the 10th anniversary, at the 25th anniversary, to spend any time thinking back. It was always paranoia about what was next.
Right. Sometime around 2000, he was interviewed, I think, with Warren Buffett. And he said that tech companies should be valued by Wall Street at a lower multiple than, say, retailers or packaged goods.
I think the multiples of technology stocks should be quite a bit lower than the multiples of stocks like Coke and Gillette, because we are subject to complete change in the rules. I know very well that in the next 10 years, if Microsoft's still a leader, there will have been at least three crises that we will have had to really prove our excellence in.
Our downfall is never farther away than two people with a garage thinking creatively. And so I think he always believed that, and he always communicated that. And I think you still see it today in a lot of, the way people will observe a threat or a risk and respond. Again, not universally, but in many cases.
Dean Carignan is co-author with Joanne Garbin of the new book, The Insider's Guide to Innovation at Microsoft. You can find links in the show notes to the book and where you can find it. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
This podcast is part of our special Microsoft at 50 series, looking at the state of the company today and what's next through the context of its history and evolution. Find a link in the show notes to the full series. Also, mark your calendars for March 20th for our special Microsoft at 50 event at Town Hall Seattle, featuring former Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer and other special guests. Find a link in the show notes or the related article to the event site where you can register to join us. Thanks to Accenture for their support in making this Microsoft at 50 project possible. Curt Milton edited this episode. I'm Geekwire co-founder Todd Bishop. We'll be back this weekend with our regular weekly episode of the Geekwire Podcast.